Hello, hello, hello. Hope everyone's keeping well. I am back like a horrible fart stuck in a cushion somewhere that comes back with a vengeance. How is everyone? Hope everyone's keeping well. Hope you can hear me okay. Just going to turn the mic down a little bit because it looks as if it's clipping a bit there. So I hope everyone's well. Bit of a new setup. I will tell you my trials and tribulations in a second. Let's quickly get... No, not that one there. I just want to quickly get this screen open here, see what's happening in the chat. So Billy's here. Hi, you're way early. Hi, Billy. Hope you're keeping well. And hope everyone is doing well at the moment. So, I am back. I'll tell you what, this has been a laugh and a half. So, let me tell you a little story. So, back in September time last year, I invested a fair bit of money on computers. So I bought a custom built PC and I got a M1 Mac Mini. And it was a great little setup. I could do everything on it. I was doing all my audio on it, all my video editing on it. It was great. But there was a little while, probably just before Christmas, Mrs. Smudge announced that the four of us were going to become 5. So we're expecting a new little bundle of joy in July this year. So we was thinking about my setup and thinking about the long-term plans and how we're going to look after little bundle of joy. And because I work from home, I've got my studio at home. Actually, I can do my music, around baby, wife going back to work, etc., etc., etc. So there's so much we can do. Most of my work I do in the evenings anyway, etc. So we decided one of the things we needed to do was think about a nice mobile setup. So I had these lovely custom built PCs, but I wanted a mobile setup. So on Boxing Day, I sold the PC and the Mac Mini, and I got a laptop. And the laptop in question was a Lenovo Legion 5. It had a Ryzen processor. It had one of the new RTX 3070 graphics cards. It performed brilliantly, absolutely amazingly. But it sounded like a blooming hairdryer. The thing was going off left, right and centre. And to be quite honest, I was actually getting quite afraid that alone, with all the hot air that was blowing out, that was going to melt the polar ice caps on its own and be the sole fault for global warming. So I thought that is not going to do, certainly for audio work. I wanted a nice quiet setup. So Lenovo Legion 5 went back, done tons of research. And I come across the MSI Creator Z16. And it come and looked really, really nice, all lovely aluminium casing and everything. It was great. It looked great. It looks as if it done the part. This was an i7 processor. So it was, one of the top-end mobile processors for laptops. Great. Thought this was going to be brilliant. However, the system, every so often, would just glitch. Probably every 10 minutes, it would just freeze for 20 seconds at a time. And it was blooming annoying, especially when doing live streams or tutorials or recording videos, etc. It was not good at all. So, after a long while of deliberation, MSI Creator Z16 went back. So, after more and more and more research, I cannot tell you how many video hours I spent just researching laptops and computers and God knows what else. So then come along it was an Asus, and it was a gaming laptop. It was an Asus G15 AMD Advantage, and the good thing about this was the fact that it not only was an AMD processor, it was one of the Ryzen 9 5900 HXs. It was a beast, this processor. It was amazing. But one of the issues I found with the MSI computer was a lot of the stuttering was to do with driver mismatches between the Intel driver and the NVIDIA driver. So I specifically didn't want to go down that route again and go with NVIDIA driver. And with the AMD, it came with the AMD Radeon RX 6800M graphics card. So it's brilliant. The AMD Advantage series, Asus does one. I think I think there's a HP Omen one. There's a few of them around, and these are the AMD Advantage laptops, and they are amazing. They are really, really good. But then all of a sudden, the Wi-Fi card died, and my studio is in downstairs. It's effectively a converted cellar. You can see from the back wall, I've got loads of work to do on it. But yeah, the Wi-Fi died, and I've got no Ethernet cable or Ethernet connection down in the studio. So that had to go back, and I thought, you know what, I'm sick and tired with all of this to-in and fro-in. So this has been going on since Boxing Day, 26th of December, I ordered the first one, and we're now on laptop 4. So I'm now on one of the 14-inch MacBook Pros, and so far I'm loving it. But the downside to all of this is it's a brand new setup. So you've got the ugly view, so you've got the horrible back wall. I've using the internal webcam, which is 1080p, thank God, because I haven't been able to get the new webcam set up so far. And it is all a bit kind of pushed together. And I thought, what a great way to actually tell you all about some of the stuff I've learned, because there is so much about computers, whether it's desktops or laptops. Oh, I can see, do you go, there's so many Macs, PCs, you've got laptops, desktops, you've got graphics cards, no graphics cards, RAMs, hard drives, and then you've got things like, what chip do you go for? Intel, AMD, Mac M1. What core speed you need, and it's just an absolute minefield. And after all of this, amount of evenings I've just kind of sat there and think, you know what, can someone please pass me a nice stiff drink, because it was getting a nightmare. And one of the things that I learnt very early on was you can look at all these different reviews, but none of them really cater for audio. So they're all very much kind of, they'll do a benchmark this and benchmark that, and this benchmark is great, and this is the great performing CPU. But in reality, a lot of this stuff, it means absolutely naff all when it comes to audio, because it's all right having a great benchmark, and you can have as many cores and as many threads as you like. But if it's unless you've got something designated or designed for audio, it's just an absolute nightmare. So what I don't want is, I don't want any of you guys to be, let's say, falling into the trap that I've fallen into, where you spend God knows how many hours, lost days, weeks. I've probably lost about 6 weeks so far in the first 3 months of the year, just through laptop issues. So hopefully I can dispel a few myths, give you some advice and some tips that I've learned along the way. I was going to do a bit more of a formal presentation, but quite frankly, there's so much to cover that I'd be sitting here for hours just creating slides. And I thought, you know what? It's my first live stream back in a little while, my first content in a while. Let's have a bit of an open Q&A. I'm going to go through, and I'm still going to do a bit of actually quite an in-depth overview of some computer specs and things you need to speak about. This is very much going to be geared towards mixing and mastering. So there is no one-size-fits-all approach. I need to make that very clear. There's not going to be any one-size-fits-all approach, because I'm looking at this purely from the mixing and mastering aspect. But if you're someone who creates your own music as well, and let's say you use a load of virtual instruments, a mixing and mastering use case may be different than it would be for someone who uses a lot of virtual instruments. Now, generally, that's going to be a lot of certainly when it comes to RAM, we'll touch on it. There's going to be a lot of overlap. So a lot of the specs that we'll go through here, a lot of things we'll talk about here will still apply. But, things like RAM, I will look at this from a mixing and mastering aspect, but there are going to be certain cases where you may need to think about things like RAM. Do you need more RAM for your use case? For things like, for those who run crazy amounts of virtual instruments, then, RAM is going to be a real key consideration. Composers, if you're into composing, things like that, RAM will be something that you will need. But it's not necessarily something you need a lot of for mixing and mastering. The bulk of your grunt work, so to speak, is going to be done by the CPU. So that's something that we're going to have real hard consideration for. So we're going to go through lots of different bits and bobs. I've made some notes. I'll go through them. But once again, I want to keep this quite light-hearted. There's so much to consider. and it's rather than just calling out specs and things like that, it'll just go go in one ear and go out the other. So I want to keep this quite light-hearted. Any questions you've got at all, please leave them in the chat. I'll go through, I've got no timescales on this, so if you've got any questions at all regards to mixing, mastering, computers, digital audio, digital gear, drop me a note in the chat and we'll go through and we'll answer some questions on the way through. I did just put a link in the chat as well. If anyone does want to support the channel, please feel free to do so through buymeacoffee.com. So once again, it's just anything that's raised here will just go towards supporting the channel, whether it's through more gear, plugins and things to do reviews on, etc. It's all going to be greatly appreciated. No obligations to do so, but it will be appreciated if anyone does want to buy me a coffee. So where do we start? So without regaling tales or further tales of distress and spontaneously combusting laptops, it's just been it's been a right pick. Anyway, I noted this best computer for mixing and mastering, and to start with, what I'm going to actually do is suggest that you actually take the word best. I hate the word best. Who is it the best for? Best for me, best for you, best for who? Everyone's going to have an individual use case. So I'm going to say take the word best, scrunch it up, throw it down the toilet, and then flush the toilet as many times as you can to get rid of the word best. I hate the word best. We don't necessarily need the best. We need something that's stable, something that's going to be perform well, but it doesn't have to be this stupidly crazy, multi-million-pound CPU that's got arms, legs, makes tea, coffee, shouts, screams, does this, does that, scratches his bum. We just need to make sure that we get something that's going to be really good. So we're going to have a brief discussion around Mac or PC, quite an interesting one that, desktop or laptop, Intel versus AMD or M1, which is the new Apple M1 chip, RAM. Do you need a dedicated GPU? Quite interesting this one. And there's quite a few different thought processes. And we look at some storage options. So what are some of the storage considerations out there? I've really broken this down into some real main considerations. I was thinking about this earlier on when I was actually, I was looking at doing some form of more formal script, but I just thought, this is something that I can't give you. I will give you some recommendations. So certainly there'll be some recommendations of some products which I think are going to be great to suit certain use cases. But what I'd recommend to anyone is to make a list of what your key considerations are. And I would think about this more broadly. So don't think about, well, it needs to have a CPU, it needs to have this amount of RAM, or it needs to have this, or it needs to have that. Think about what you want from a computer. And one of the things that I really found that I needed, certainly with doing things like live streaming and video capture when I do my tutorials, is I need a really quiet or silent setup. And this is probably one of the things that is probably so underrated, is we don't consider the noise that computers can make. So think about things of, when you're looking at any purchase or looking at a decision around computers, think about things like, well, do you need it to be mobile? So if you need it to be mobile, is a laptop the best option? And if the laptop is the best option, then you've got to think about, well, think about things like battery power. Well, how long do you need it to run for? Or are you quite happy carrying the charger around and, leaving it plugged in all the time? Because that's something else that we don't really consider. And it's depending on what option you go for, it can make a massive difference whether you want it plugged in or unplugged. So think about your ideal setup. What would it mean? Do you want a nice quiet setup? Are you looking at things like stability? All those kind of things. So I've done some basic considerations. So we need a good performing CPU for power hungry plugins. That is a must. Especially when it comes to mastering. A lot of the mastering plugins are very CPU intensive. And even if you're looking at this from a mixing context, and if you've got, say, a project that's like 80 tracks and you're going to apply 3, 4, 5, on average, probably not on average, but let's just say if you was to take an average of, say, 5 plugins per track, then you've got a heck of a lot of plugins built up. So you need to have a good performing CPU. We're going to go through some considerations in a minute. You need a good amount of RAM, and once again, I put a good amount of RAM. For mixing and mastering, I think this is one of the things where I've never really had a bottleneck due to the amount of RAM that I've had. Now, I still think there's a minimum standard that you should kind of look for. But, you know, you don't need to be building a system that's got like, you know, 128 gigs worth of RAM, or even, you know, not necessarily even 64 gigs of RAM. It's kind of getting a nice balance, and kind of think about your budget as well. Where are you going to put your money, and how are you going to proportion your budget? And I think that's something that that really needs to be considered. Fast storage, both internal and external, that's quite an interesting one, and there'll be a few different use cases for this. Once again, one of the most underrated things is stability, and this is the thing: is it's kind of I'll carry on this a little bit in a little bit later, but stability is kind of crucial when you're working on a relatively dense session. You want to get into the situation where you're focusing 100% on the music. You don't want to be in a situation where your system's freezing, or this isn't working, or that's not working. So stability is going to be so important in terms of your overall productivity and your creativity. So that is something. And a quiet, silent system. And for me, this has probably turned into the most underrated feature. And it's not until you get something like Lenovo, and let's be clear, that Lenovo was a fantastic machine. But yeah, if I wanted something like sounded like a Boeing 747, then I'd recommend it, but I don't, unfortunately, so it wasn't for me. Stationary or mobile, which we've discussed. Port selection. Now, this is probably quite a crucial one, because this is really going to determine what options you go for, whether it's looking at motherboards or whether you're looking at laptops. So port selection. Do you need Thunderbolt or USB? Because that is probably quite a key consideration. So if it's Thunderbolt, then that excludes one selection of certainly chips out of the equation. So if you need Thunderbolt, then that kind of narrows it down. USB, you've got much more options. And then lastly, do I need a dedicated GPU, which we'll come on to a little bit later. Right, let me quickly turn this on to Do Not Disturb on. Should have done that earlier. Okay, first one. Let's get the big question out of the way. And for start, can we just start by saying I'm not a fanboy of any make. I'm not affiliated to any make, and I really don't do this fanboy stuff. So, Mac or PC, great one. This one always makes me laugh, and it always features on the Presonus Facebook group. In short, they're both amazing. They are both amazing. You can do great stuff on a Mac or PC. It really should not be your choice of should I go for a Mac or PC because you think it's the only thing you can do music on. Seriously. Both of them are going to be great, but there are slightly different considerations. So, you know, something you need to consider is the main difference between a Mac and a PC really is going to be your operating system. Obviously, PC's on Windows, Mac runs on Mac OS. So I don't even know what the new one's called. I don't know. They seem to come up with a new name each week. Monterey, is it Monterey? Could be Monterey. But yeah, Windows 11 and Monterey. So if you get a new system now, you will get either of those. You may still get a Windows 10, but even if I got, even when I had the Windows 10 option, it automatically uploaded to Windows 11 when I was doing the initial setup. So you're going to get one of those options. Both have a learning curve, but they're both easy to overcome. They both have their pros and cons. Macs do have AU plugin capability, but to be honest, I don't really see that being a plus. I don't use AU plugins at all. VST plugins work on both OS, and I always recommend VST plugins over any other formats for either both Mac or PC. So I don't really see that being a consideration, but it is just something to bear in mind that you can have AU plugins if you want them. DAWs, once again, most of the people who follow this channel, myself, we love Studio One, but if you're not a Studio One user, just be mindful, Logic's Mac only, and something like Cakewalk by BandLab is obviously for PC only. But if you, like us, most of us who use Studio One, it's cross-compatible. Studio One now has full M1 native compatibility. It's great, so it's really not an issue on any of the new Macs. Something to be mindful of, though, is not all plugins are compatible with M1 native at current. So what does that mean? So it means that when the M1 chips were released, you may have heard of a system called Rosetta, which effectively it's or what do they call it? It's a emulator. So it emulates the system as it is, or as it would have been on an Intel basis. So any plugins that were, working on an Intel-based system, they would be emulated to work in in Mac on the M1 chips. That's not M1 native. What M1 native is, it means is it doesn't need any emulation to run, so it will run natively on the M1 chip. So not all plugins are M1 native, even now, and we are... The first Macs, or the Macs on the M1s, were released in 2020. So we must be coming up almost 2 years, and they're still not all M1 compatible. So I'll give you an example. IK Multimedia. I love my IK Multimedia stuff, but I can't use them at the moment. I can use Amplitude, but all of the T-Rex stuff isn't compatible, which is fine. I've got plenty of workarounds at the moment. Of course, Studio One comes with so many great plugins. All my TDR stuff is, that's all compatible, that's all fine. I've got so many different plugins that I can use. So, you know, it's something to bear in mind that still at this moment in 2022, not all plugins are M1 native supported. Now, you could get around this by using Rosetta. Once again, Rosetta is the emulator. But to do that, what you'd have to do is set your DAW to be function in Rosetta mode. So you will lose some of the performance enhancements you get from running on the M1 as a native program. But if you run your DAW in Rosetta mode, then any plugins that are Rosetta compatible will obviously run. So if I do, for whatever reason, need any of my IK stuff, I can run Studio One in Rosetta mode. I don't really plan to, and but it's an option there. Chip selection. This is really quite an interesting one, and obviously on PC you can choose between Intel and AMD. And on Mac, well, if you get a new Mac, you can only choose one of the M1 chips. So that's basically your decision. So if you want to go for PC, you can choose between Intel or AMD. Macs now have their own proprietary M1 chips. You can still get the Intel on the older models, but really I wouldn't even worry about getting an Intel-based Mac because it's not going to perform as good as the M1s. Intel 12900K beats the Ryzen in terms of performance single-core processing. I'll come on to that in a second, Nick. Very interesting you brought it up, because this is quite an interesting part. Right, uniformity of parts. Now this is something here that I think is quite crucial and not really thought about, or if it is, it's maybe sometimes overlooked. What do I mean by uniformity of parts? Right, Mac, if you think about a Mac, everything is basically Apple now. So you think about the whole architecture, it's all Apple designed, everything's designed, the hardware inside is designed by Apple. It's an Apple M1 chip. The graphics is all integrated on that M1 chip. The RAM is all integrated on that chip. Even the flash drives, I don't call them SSDs because they're not technically SSDs, I'm led to believe. They're flash drives. But the storage is even proprietary for the Apple. So everything now is going to be Apple ecosystem. So it's very much geared towards being this whole cohesive unit. PC is not quite so the case though. So if you think of, if you build a custom built PC, you can have a PC with an Asus motherboard, an Intel CPU, an Nvidia GPU. They're all going to have different drivers, all different firmware. So behind the scenes, they have to all work together and be compatible to ensure the most stable performance. And this is one of the things that I kind of find out with the MSI. And it's not to say this is a bad laptop at all, because it was, once again, it did everything that I needed it to do, but there were clear, I don't want to say compatibility issues, but there was a clear mismatch between the NVIDIA drivers and the Intel driver. We never really got to the bottom of it. MSI didn't really get to the bottom of it, and it went back before I really did anything else with it, because it was literally getting to a stage where I was wasting far too much time with it, and it literally, I had to delete the Intel audio driver, graphics driver, delete that. I had to delete all the NVIDIA drivers, reinstall everything, and it was literally getting to a right pain just to make sure there was no stability issues. So I think it's something that's really worth bearing in mind. Now, once again, this is probably just an isolated incident, but it is something to consider when you've got all these different moving parts, and when you're relying on all these companies to make everything stable and make sure it works with each other. It is a consideration that I would recommend that you look into, and certainly get some reviews on how those systems perform from others who have got similar systems. Power consumption. This is probably quite a big difference between the PC and the Mac. PC will consume far greater power to drive components over Apple to achieve similar performance levels. Now, I say this to achieve similar performance levels. You know, I think the stats speak for themselves. If you was to get a fully fledged custom built PC with the top of the range everything, you would more than likely get performance that will outweigh the Apple. I don't think that's really, I don't really think that's an issue. But it will draw far much more power, and especially when you've got things like the power units you can get on custom built PCs now. They're massive power supplies that go into these things, because they have to be massive to drive all of your GPUs and your CPUs and God knows what else. They have to be big units to really drive those systems, and that obviously comes with the consequence of, they will have far greater power consumption. Price is another consideration as well. Obviously, the cost of entry to Apple products are far greater generally than they are for PCs, whether that's laptop or desktop. Things have changed quite a bit now, certainly with the M1 products. But still, if I look at some of the products that the Apple have launched, I was thinking about this in terms of recommendations earlier on, and it's kind of like, am I still going to recommend certainly an Apple desktop? Probably not, but I'll come on to that a little bit later. So really, let's get into the nitty-gritty of things. So, once we've got the Apple or PC, your main consideration there is going to be your operating system. Does the software you want to work with, does it function on those operating systems? If it doesn't function on Mac, then it kind of rules it out. If you don't want to change door, or if you don't want to change some of the software you use, your plugins, then Mac may not be the best option, or vice versa. If it only works on Mac, then you may not want to consider a PC. But there are different options out there. But that's probably one of the key considerations out there. And I think the other thing as well is uniformity of parts. Certainly Apple, I think, has got the edge on that one. Nick's wrote a question. Also bear in mind, GPU can impact on latency. Certainly it can do. It's quite interesting the GPU and how the GPU may or may not actually impact on the overall system performance. And it wasn't until I actually started to look into this a little bit more. Just because you've got a GPU on a dedicated GPU on a system doesn't mean it's actually doing anything. And this is quite an interesting kind of eye opener. I think a lot of us kind of expect, because we've got it will work. Sometimes though, if it doesn't need to work, or you don't designate that it should work, it won't. So therefore, in certain circumstances, it can. You really need to look into these things, and I think this is where Apple once again has a little bit of the edge, because it's pretty much an out of the box setup. You kind of all plug it in, do the basic setup, and off you go. Whereas PCs do need a little bit more tweaking, but if you're prepared to do that tweaking, you can get some fantastic results. So, it's one of those things to be mindful of. So, desktop or laptop, then it all goes down to mobility, basically. Do you need something to be mobile? Desktop will generally have greater performance. And I say this, a desktop, certainly in terms of PC, a desktop PC will have a greater performance, because chips are the Intel or AMD chips used are going to be far more powerful. They're going to be far more, maybe not necessarily have the more cores, but certainly when it comes to things like core clock speed, they're going to be higher. So you're going to get more performance out of the CPU on a desktop-based system than you would do a laptop. Of course, there are variants. One of the things I really hate when I see someone give advice about what system should I get, and just someone says, "I'll just get an i7." Get an i7. That is such a lazy answer, because there are so many different varieties of an i7 that it just makes it it's just an illogical answer, which I'll show you in a minute. But yeah, generally desktops will have greater performance, and it opens up more options in terms of certainly what I would recommend over a laptop. So that's certainly something that a desktop CPU and GPU will be much more powerful on a desktop. Something that once again, something that people don't bear in mind is when you buy, say, a laptop and it's got a NVIDIA RTX 3060 in it. And they think, it's got a 3060, that's great. What they don't realise is the laptop variety will have a 6 gig VRAM, but the desktop version on the standard 3060 has 12 gig VRAM. So it's not even in comparison, and it's not easy to really, unless you do the digging and find out that information, it's not really easy to determine that. And also you've got to think about the power considerations as well. A lot of the laptop systems, they will have thermal constraints. because they have to, because they will run much hotter, because there's less space for the heat to get around, which is why laptops are always noisy. The fans have to work a little bit more overtime, and obviously you can create more space, have more fans, have different cooling systems in desktops, so it's something to really consider. It's a little bit different with Mac. Mac, this is quite an interesting one. So the Mac options, they have no CPU variations. And what do I mean by this? Obviously, there are CPU variations because you have now the M1, the M1 Pro, the M1 Max, and the M1 Ultra. But if you think about the M1, the original M1, it's the same chip that went in the MacBook Air, MacBook Pro, the Mac Mini, and the iMac. So the 24-inch iMac all had the same chip. So there was no difference in the chip. There's a slight variance depending on whether you went for, I think there was a 7-core GPU and an 8-core GPU. That was the only variance. So it's the GPU that kind of changes rather than the CPU. So they all were based on that same chip with a slight GPU variance. So it's, you're not going to get any difference between the desktop version and the laptop version. Except if you've seen any of these, if anyone's geeky enough like I have that's seen any of these benchmarks, I think the iMac still has a slightly better performance, and it's not because of the chip, it's because the iMac has 2 fans. The Mac Mini and the MacBook Pro, I think, only had 1, and the MacBook Air didn't have any fans. So there was no cooling solution for the MacBook Air. So it would basically thermal throttle quicker, which means you'd have then dips in performance. Whereas the iMac had slightly better performance because it was better at cooling the system, so it could run more efficiently. Now, we're not talking massive gains here, certainly not talking massive amounts, but you will still see on some of the benchmarks that with the original MacBooks, that the iMac would perform slightly better. I think the Mac Mini was second with the MacBook Pro third. So yeah, there's no real, variation amongst the CPUs if you go for that model. So another example would be, if you think about the M1 Max now, well, oh gosh, they're bringing out these new M1 chips all the time. M1 Max, you can get the M1 Max on the 14-inch, 16-inch MacBook Pros, and you can get the M1 Max on the Mac Studio, which is like the entry-level Mac Studio now. You can get the M1 Max, but it's the same chip. All they do is they vary GPU cores, basically. So that's pretty much the discernible factor when it comes to the Apple now. It's you choose what kind of chip you want, and the variations are very, very limited based on whether you go for a laptop or a desktop option. So it makes it a little bit simpler to make a decision in that respect. But there are so many. It's just, I put here the iGPU options are flexible because that's pretty much what you're paying the money for. If you need something that's got 32 whatever of GPU, then go for the really expensive one. But you don't necessarily need it for, certainly not for mixing and mastering. Cooling options, greater on PC desktop. That's generally quieter. Yeah, this is quite a big one. Laptops have always been known to run hotter. It's just because there's nowhere for the air to go, and one thing that the laptop manufacturers now, they're running all different heat pipes through the systems, multiple fans, cooling chambers, and all sorts of things to try and make the systems run cooler. The only real way to get them to run cooler is to limit performance and fan noise. That's the only real way to get them to run cooler. Whereas desktops, you can create cooling solutions. You can go for basic fan-based cooling, or you can go liquid cooling. And even if you want to go for something that runs a little bit more loud from a cooling perspective, you can get different cases. So you can really modify your case. One thing that's quite interesting, you can get a quiet case, but I'll tell you now, in my experience, a quiet case isn't silent. You will still get noise from it. I had what was my system based on? It was an 11700K. It was water cooled with a Corsair quiet case. It had the acoustic bits inside. I could still hear the fans. Nothing beyond ridiculous, but I could still hear it. But certainly laptop, depends what you get. It may sound like a full-on Dyson vacuum at some point if you want that. I certainly didn't. So generally, cooling options is going to be greater on a desktop. Thus, generally, you will get them to run quieter. RAM's another consideration. I don't think it applies too much in this particular instance when we're looking at mixing and mastering, but you can get RAM in desktops. You can get it running up to, what, 128 gigs. You don't need anything like that for mixing and mastering. It's one of those things where people say, if you're running, if you're someone who's using a system who, they're doing multi-use. So if they're writing music, using a lot of VSTs, VST instruments and things like that, you want some more RAM. I've never had a bottleneck due to RAM, and most of the systems I've used run on 16 or 32 gig. This is running on 16 now. My last few laptops are running on 16. There was no limitations. I had no issues or bottlenecks due to RAM. It was all other issues. So, I would still recommend 16 gigabytes of RAM as a kind of a minimum. I think 8 is just not enough. If you think, I think most operating systems now use like 4 gig of RAM just to run. So if you're running Windows or Mac OS, then you've got to expect 4 gig of your RAM to be used up just with the operating system. So if you get a system with 8 gigs, then you're really limiting yourself. So I think 16 gig of RAM is a good, is certainly a good starting point. If you find you do need more because you're doing lots of different work through VSTs and stuff like that outside of your mixing and mastering, then 32, 64 may be an option. And RAM prices are coming down, which is really good to see as well. What else was I going to say? I was going to say something on this here. Just don't. I think it was just really to reiterate. Don't forget, I'm very much looking at this from a mixing and mastering aspect. But I think this, one of the considerations I wanted here, and why it's so difficult to make recommendations, is not everyone has a computer for a certain need. As in, it would be a massive luxury if I could sit here and say, I've got a massive desktop downstairs in the studio, and I've got a lovely, powerful laptop that I can use upstairs and take out with me and things like that. And yeah, if I had a bottomless pit of money, then I'd do so. But not everyone's in that boat. I'm certainly not, which is why I need something to do everything. And a lot of people are in the same boat. Some of the things that I for my considerations that I need a GPU. I do video editing for this channel, and I need something that's going to perform well for live streams, for video editing. So that's a consideration for me. It may not be a consideration for everyone. So I really want to keep this focused on the mixing and mastering. But do bear in mind, if you have got other needs as well, a lot of the things that a lot of the recommendations will be great, multi-use systems anyway. But it's just to bear in mind that, if you want something that runs with greater RAM, then you might need to think about something different as well. Internal storage capacity is another one, and I think this is a thing where, unless you go Apple, most systems now you can upgrade storage. Even laptops now, most modern laptops give you at least one. Most now have two M.2 SSD storage bays. So you could run a system easily with two internal 1 terabyte drives, M.2 super fast whizzy drives. That's something. But obviously, if you get a desktop, you can run so many. You can have M.2, you can have standard SSDs, you can have bays of them if you want. You can really have as much as you want. So if you want some purely for, songs, if you want to save all your songs files, your client files, backup, very important to have backup files. Then obviously with a desktop you can have all that in the same system. You can actually build it so you've got multiple files already lined up. With a laptop you are going to be a little bit more restricted, but you can still have two in most laptops now, and unless you're Apple, which will only let you have one, and if you want to pay for through the nose for it's ridiculous. I think it's something like a 2 terabyte storage, flash drive storage through Apple. I think it's something stupid like either $400 or $800 on top of the price. It is ridiculous. So once again, internal storage is going to be something to consider as well. I actually tend to use a lot of external storage, so for me it wasn't so much of an issue. So I run a system here with I have cloud-based backup, and I run 2 external SSDs. So for me, I only need an OS drive in this system. So for me, I've got a 1TB external, and I think this is a 500 gig that I've got for my videos. So I do all my video stuff on one drive, and I've got all my audio stuff on another. And just while we're on that point, it's probably good to have a look at how you run setups, because you don't need to have a load stored on your internal storage. And I know a lot of people like to keep everything on the internal, but you really don't need it. So let's take Studio One as an example. I have Studio One downloaded. I don't download any sound sets on the internal storage. That all goes off to an external storage. So my SanDisk SSD external, they all goes on there. All of my audio files, all of my audio projects all go on externals. All of my video files go on externals. And the thing is, if you start thinking about, you might have to pay a little bit more money in terms of, it might cost you an extra 20-30 quid on top of some of these SSDs to get one with a really fast drive. But it'll make your system so much happier because you're not putting so much additional load on your internal hard drive. Even if you've got an SSD, SSDs are quite interesting, because once you fill an SSD up to around, I think it's around 70% of capacity, you will start to lose hard drive speed or solid state drive speed. So, there's two trains of thought here. Don't load it up with unnecessary content if you can load it off to an external drive. And secondly, you still need to make sure you have, a relatively good internal drive in terms of storage capacity. I wouldn't recommend anything less than 512 for an internal. This is 512. I spent a lot of time getting rid of a load of my plugins because I wasn't using them. A load of the free ones you get, a load of the trials, demos, and I went through a load of clearing out. 512 is absolutely fine for me. I've got everything downloaded on this that I need so far. I think I've only filled like 160 gigs, so I know I've got a lot in reserve there. And with storing all the sound sets and everything externally, it's not an issue. But I would say that's probably going to be the minimum, 512. If you can afford to get a 1TB drive, or if you go for a PC, then even if you can't afford one, you can get one later on down the line, and they're relatively easy to do, to change them out, and they're easily sourceable as well. So you don't have to buy it from the manufacturer. You can always save some money and get one at additional date. Right, let's have a discussion, and this is going to be a funny one. Intel versus AMD or M1. So yeah, this is really going to be quite interesting, and some quite interesting results. First and foremost, I think with any recommendation I give you, you've got to consider where you are in the world. And I'm going to give you a prime example. If I buy a Mac in the UK, if I bought it direct from Apple, it will be £1,899, gross British pounds. That's it. If that's direct from Apple, 1,899.99, I think it is. If you buy an Apple in the US, you will pay $1,999. So actually you're paying $100 more, but $100 more obviously isn't $100 more. I had a look earlier on, and the conversion rate from US dollars to gross British pounds puts $1,999 at just over 1,500 quid. So it's going to cost around about 350 quid more to get a MacBook in the UK than it would in the US. So take that in mind, because it may change your difference. It may change some of the considerations you might look at. So think about where you are in the world as well, and what the local costs are to you. Because something I can say now, I could come up with a suggestion and think, well, would I recommend this for this particular market? And it may not, because it may not be price competitive against something else. So that's something to consider as well. But let's get on to Intel versus AMD, and the results are quite interesting. And Nick's mentioned there the Intel 1200K beats the Ryzen in terms of performance single-core processing. Yeah, it probably does. In fact, I can look at any of the 12th gen Intel processors now and say to you, they beat pretty much everything in single-core performance. However, single-core performance isn't the be-all and end-all when it comes to audio, and this is probably one of the big things. Laptop, when it comes to making a decision, do you go Intel or AMD or M1? Well, first and foremost, do you need Thunderbolt ports? Because if you need Thunderbolt, then if you're buying a laptop, you've got two options. Intel, it's an Intel PC or it's a Mac. You cannot get, as far as I'm aware, an AMD laptop with Thunderbolt 4. USB-C, but they're not Thunderbolt compatible. Now there are, the last time I looked on desktops, I think there were about 5 AMD-based motherboards that supported Thunderbolt connectivity, but I do know there were issues with connectivity with certain interfaces, so that is a consideration. So yes, you could build an AMD system with a Thunderbolt motherboard for desktop, but it may not be compatible with all Thunderbolt devices. So if you want Thunderbolt, you've got a choice, Intel or Mac, pretty much as straightforward as that. So if you don't need Thunderbolt, now this is where I'm going to have to caveat this a bit. The new 12th gen Intel chips, certainly the mobile chips, have just come out, or just coming out, in the process of coming out as we speak. They've been rolling out over the last month. I believe, Nick, the 12th series Intel come out on desktop around October time, so they've been out for a little while now. But certainly the mobile chips are only just coming out. So I don't. The thing with the 12th gen chips it's new technology. It's difficult to say how they're going to perform and how they do perform, because the way it was done beforehand, it was very simple. You had your base core clock speed, you had a turbo speed, you had cores and multi-core threading. So if you had a multi-threaded chip that had, 8 cores, generally speaking, it will be 8 core 16 thread. Something along those kind of lines, but it's changed now. The 12th gen technology has changed, so they're very much moving in the same direction as Apple with the x86 architecture. And without going too technical, with some of the chips now, you don't just get a straightforward 8-core CPU. A lot of them are now coming with, you have performance cores and efficiency cores. So because this is new stuff on Intel, it's very difficult to really say at the moment how they perform. All I can really make recommendations on is their core clock speeds at the moment. So why is this important? Well, it's not just a case of, if you have something that's got, the more cores it's got, the better it's going to perform. It doesn't work like that. Now, for certain applications, that may certainly be true. So for certain things, certain applications, the more cores you got, certainly the performance could be better, but not for audio. And this is where we need to kind of differentiate between the core counts and the clock speed. So a base core clock speed is the basic is the amount of work it can do before it kind of starts to struggle, and you have turbo boosting, which kind of gets it over. The problem with turbo boosting is it's not sustained performance. So if you get something, let's say you've got something with a, I'll give you an example here. I wrote down an example of an Intel chip. It had a base core clock speed of 2.3 gigahertz, but it's actually got a turbo boost up to 4.7 gigahertz. So 4.7 sounds great, but the reality is that's not sustained performance. So you're not going to get that over a long period of time. So when it comes to audio, you need to start thinking about the core base clock speed. Almost, actually, that could have been even more funny if I'd said something else. But the reason this is important, because the way that audio works with a lot of the modern performance DAWs, is they will start to, rather than spreading tasks over multiple cores, they will load single cores. So if you've got something with a low base clock speed, it will very quickly cap out, and it will start going. It needs to go into turbo mode to keep up. Well, that's not sustained performance. So when it comes to CPU for audio, you need to have something with a decent core clock speed. I swear I'm going to get that mixed up in a minute and say something rather rude, but hey, it's probably part of the course with me. So that's a consideration. So going back to Nick's point earlier on, the Intel 12900K beats Ryzen in terms of performance single core processing. Yeah, absolutely, I'm sure it does, but the issue with audio is you need something that's going to have a good base clock speed. And if it hasn't, then for audio, it may not perform as well, even though overall it may perform better in terms of the single core processing. And this is the thing to consider. So I've done a few comparisons. And I'm going to show you a different screen in a second and show you some of the results I found. So let's think about the i7. Once again, I don't want to go too much into the 12th gen stuff because it's still a bit of an unknown, but the 12700H, which is the one of the higher end mobile units for laptops at the moment, it's got a base core clock speed of 2.3 gigahertz. Now, the Ryzen 9 6900HS, which is one of their new mobile CPUs, has got a base core clock speed of 3.2 gigahertz. So it's actually, it's quite a lot more. The i7 11800H was pretty much the big Intel one up until the 12th gen. Obviously, there was a few i9s, but the i7 11800H, once again, its core base speed was 2.3 gigahertz, whereas the Ryzen 9 5900HX was 3.3. So Intel are great at overall performance. And let me show you this now. If I go into, let me go into here, and let me go into the web browser. And these are some different results got earlier on. So this is why it's quite interesting, and this is why we really need to start thinking and looking into this a little bit further. So if you look here, these are going to show you benchmarks for different chips, and these are going to be all sorts of different chips. Some of these are going to be desktop, some of these are going to be laptop. They're all going to be, these particular ones, I think these are new laptop. And this is going to give you your multi-core performance. So it's going to be the overall performance over different cores. And then if you look here, if we go look at single thread, and then we scroll down here, like I say, 12900K is right up there. I mean, this is showing the KS and the KF being slightly above it. But the problem with this is it's okay having a single core performance, but in an audio world, how well is it going to perform? So if you look at the i9 1200K, the core clock speed is 3.2, and it has a turbo of 5.2. So whilst it looks on paper, it looks really powerful, and certainly in terms of the benchmarks, it's certainly, you can see here, it's performed much better than any of the AMDs. But if we go to somewhere like the Apple M1 Ultra 20 core, what's this? It's got, yeah, I mean, that's 3.2, so that's not too bad. So it compares well against certainly the M1 Ultra from that perspective. Let's have a look, see if there's any AMD on here. Let's have a look at the AMD Ryzen 9. So the 5950X, 3.4. So even that, so on desktop, it's not too bad. But actually thinking about it, 16 cores, 32 threads. Now, thread count isn't the be-all and end-all, but it'd be interesting to see how the core clock speed compares. Be interesting to see some further tests on that and how the 12900K works. Let's have a look, see if we've got any more specs on here. So this is where it gets really interesting. So it's a 16-core CPU and a 24-thread machine. So you get 8 cores and 8 threads on the efficiency cores. Now the efficiency cores, they're going to be lower core base clock speeds. They're not there for the main bulk of the work. It's the performance cores, 8 cores, 16 threads with a 3.2 gigahertz base. Yeah, it'd be really interesting to see how these stack up from the position of the audio, because they look really quite good on paper. I do a lot of what's the words I'm looking for? I speak to Scan Computers a lot in the UK because they do a lot of analysis work on door benchmarks, and I know they're going to be looking into this. But I'd be really keen to kind of see what results they come back with. I know certainly from a mobile solution, so in terms of laptops, they don't recommend Intel. And the reason they don't recommend Intel is because of that core clock speed, and it's no wonder why. When you've got a base core clock speed that is over 1 gigahertz higher, it's going to mean that you're going to get better performance before it starts kicking into the turbo mode. Desktops, this is where it all gets a bit, I don't want to say up in the air, but I think my recommendation, I think my notes here said it's kind of like, it's the world's your oyster when it comes to desktop, because it's kind of, well, how much more performance do you need? And if you get something like the 12900K, it's going to be more than ample for mixing and mastering. I had the 11700K, and it was just like, it was a that was just it was just a monster. It was just so good, and that was. Let me see if he's got it on here. Here we are. So it's at 3.6. So it's got the 3.6 gig core clock speed with a turbo boost up to 5. It was just amazing. Anything I threw at it, it was just like, it wasn't even flinching. So desktops, you can really. This is where I think where people like. If you can do a desktop, you'll get so much more performance for your money, but you don't necessarily have to go for something like a 12900K. I still think something like a 12th gen. Did they do a 12th gen 12700 or something like that? That would be really interesting to see. So you've got like a 12700K there. By you, it's not a massive amount of difference. Well, I suppose it's $200. $200 is $200. So it's kind of like, let's have a look at the specs on that. See, this is the thing here. 12 cores, 20 threads. For mixing and mastering, if you've got a base core clock speed of 3.6 gigahertz, with 8 cores, 16 threads, and you've got the efficiency cores on top. This is where it starts to make, really starts to look into, do you need the 12900K? I don't think you would, and save yourself $200 in the meantime. It's got a higher turbo, but the performance cores are the same. It has more efficiency cores, but do you need them? I don't know you would. Honestly, wouldn't think you would. I think something like a 12700K would be an absolute beast of a machine. But this is where you've got to really start looking into the nitty gritty. Whereas you look at these single core performances, and you think, oh, Intel all the way. Certainly for mobile, it just doesn't work like that. And if we go up here to new laptop, and if we then look at the 12, let's look at the 12700H. You can see here, look, it's like, if you compare these two, the Intel Core i7 12700H, it's got a multi-core mark over 3,000 points higher than the AMD. But if you then look at it, it's got 14 cores, 20 threads, but the base clock speed is 2.3 gigahertz, which is kind of like, it's not going to perform for audio as well as your the AMD, wherever the blooming hell that is. Where is it? Oh, it's probably because I clicked off that 12700H. Yeah, so here we are, the Ryzen 9 6900HS. It's a 3.2. So you'll get better performance from an audio perspective from the AMD on the laptop side than you would do on the Intel side by some considerable way. Desktop, it's a whole different ballgame. So this is certainly something that that we need to kind of look into. And where else was I going with this? Here we are. And this was another thing I was going to say. When we talk about the i7s and just get an i7 and be done with it, it doesn't work like that. And you can't just get any old i7. You've got to really look at the specs. Because here we've got the i7 11800H, which is kind of like, one of the top end of the mobile processors. And we've got the i7 1165G7, both 11th gen core i7 processors. But they both function completely differently. And if you look at the base specs, you've got the i7 11800H is an 8-core system, but the 1165G7 is a 6-core, or is it a 4-core? 4-core laptop with 8 threads. So it's not even comparable. They're both two i7s, both 11th gen, but you can't just say, well, get an i7 and be done with it. It doesn't work like that. Interestingly, though, the base core clock speed of the 1165G7 is 2.8, but you'll still get much better performance from the 11800H, just because of the further cores and the multi-cores you will get. It will outweigh the increase on the core clock speed. So, we've really got to look into these things. I think as it stands at the moment, certainly from a laptop perspective, it's really difficult to recommend an Intel processor or an Intel chip for audio on laptops at the moment. I really want to see how these 12th gen perform. But if you just look at the basics of the single thread performance or the actual core clock speeds of the chips from AMD, if you're going for PC, you'll get much better processing power for mixing and mastering on an AMD chip than you would do on an Intel based chip for laptops. I still want to see on here. So this is quite interesting. The Apple M1s, the Apple M1 Pro 10 core. So this is really quite, because you look at the multi-core here, 22602, the M1 Pro 10 core, 22357. There's not much difference in them because they're basically, it's the same. The M1 Max and the M1 Pro are effectively the same chip with different GPU cores on. So it's not really, you're not going to get much different CPU performance out of them. Even I went for, I think mine was the base model, so I think mine was the 8-core, here we are, even that's 3.2, but you look at the core clock speed, 3.2 gigahertz. So if you compare that against something like the Intel i7-11800H, you know, you still get better single core performance out of the M1 Pro than you would do the Intel i7-11800H for audio. It's very certainly for mixing and mastering. So I think that's something that's very much that needs to be considered. Let's go back to the ugly mugshot view, and I just want to go back here and just see if there's any questions. Okay. So in terms of desktops is pretty much, I think this is where it's basically a case of budget. Laptops will put you back more. Simple as that, because you've got to pay for a screen. So any laptop you buy, there'll be a screen involved, and if it's QHD or like the Max, I think this is like a 4K, whatever it is, HDR screen, you are paying a premium for that. I mean, I've really used the screen because it's got the big monitor here. But you've got to pay for a screen because it comes with a laptop, so that's instantly going to bump up the cost. So you will get more bang for your buck with a desktop-based system, certainly, and you'll get a better performance. So if you can go for a dedicated desktop system, you get so much more for your money, and you've got so many more options. Intel, AMD, certainly what they're doing now. It'll be really interesting to see how these Intel chips are doing. Like I say, it's not a simple case now. You have cores and threads. You've got performance cores, efficiency cores, and they all have their individual threads. So it's really going to start to technologies we're moving on. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the results are. Yeah, it does become a case of how much performance do you really need. I suppose if you were looking at it from a future-proof perspective, nothing's really ever future-proof. But if you think about a desktop, you can customize everything in there. So if you had if you've got a motherboard you know was going to last a few generations, so if you bought a new motherboard and you knew it was going to last a few generations, you could buy different chips, of course, and get the latest chips. You can upgrade the RAM. RAM now is quite interesting because RAM is even upgraded. It's not on the DDR4 RAM now. It's now on DDR5 on the new 12th gen laptops, certainly, and I'd imagine it is the case with the desktops as well. And the AMD are supporting DDR5, so you'll get better RAM speed as well. So it is just a minefield. But desktops, you can certainly do much more with them. But it's, once again, it's not for everyone. If you need a mobile setup like I do, desktop isn't an option. So we've covered Mac or PC, desktop, laptop, Intel versus AMD or M1, RAM. RAM's an interesting one. Like I say, I wouldn't get too hung up on RAM for mixing and mastering. I would recommend 16 gig. If you get most laptops for, they're going to cost you a premium anyway. But most of the laptops that I'll discuss, 16 gigs a minimum. Some of them now come with 32 gigs. But even if you get a 16 gigabyte minimum laptop, as long as it's not an Apple product, you can upgrade it later. Apple you can't. So if you buy obviously a Mac, you got to pay the premium, get the RAM that you need. Mixing and mastering, I still think 16 gigs would be great. If you start to do other stuff, 32 gig. You know, if you do any video editing, any intense video editing, or if you do any virtual instruments, then you want to be looking at something like 32 gig. But for mixing and mastering, 16 gig should be absolutely fine. What else have we not covered? Storage. Storage options. Now, this is once again, technology is moving on so quickly, and you know, it wasn't. If you think about it, it was only probably 5 or 6 years ago when it was still, you know, everyone was still using spinning hard drives, and it was, you know, a big speed change from the old 5400 RPM disk drives to a 7200 RPM disk drive, and the gains that you got from that, and then you went into SSDs and massive increases in gains from SSDs, and they got faster and faster, and now you're getting the M.2 drives, and prices are coming down. I think this is the thing: is SSDs is storage is don't get any spinning disks. Even if you need something as a backup, or as if you want to back up to something like that, yeah, then maybe get something like a 7200 RPM hard drive. You could probably pick up a 4 terabyte drive for next to nothing now, and it'd be a great backup drive, just so you got something there as a backup. But I certainly wouldn't recommend it for anything like certainly the operating system, but even things like you know, audio files, saving projects to. They're just going to be so much slower than even just a standard SSD. And the way that the SSDs are going now, with the speeds on them, it's just external storage is another thing. It's so quick to get the information from an external drive into your computer. I think storage is something that just base it on your needs. Don't think if you go the Apple route, don't go big on the internal. Just think about what you need and add a little bit more, so you protect yourself. For me, the 512 gigabit is fine for me. But you start paying a premium, and if you need more, I think the jump from 512 to a terabyte, it is something stupid like. In fact, I think it's 200 quid for that. Then if you go to 2 terabytes, it's 400 quid. And if you go to the 4 terabyte, it's like 800 quid. It's ridiculous. And you think, you know, how many 1 terabyte drives can you buy on a PC for 800 quid? Loads. So, you know, if you're going to Apple, just try and keep it pretty bare bones from that perspective. Give yourself a little bit of headroom, and then you know, spend some money on some external drives. But with storage, I wouldn't recommend anything. You know, SSDs now are great. I would always go with name brand. If you're getting a custom built PC from an audio company, I've had that problem where they used their own brand SSDs and the hard drive died after 2 months. So I wouldn't recommend known brands. So if you can, you know, it's not going to cost you a massive amount more, probably like 30-40 quid, just to have like a name brand. But at least you're going to have that peace of mind that at least you're going to have something that's going to last. And then the last one, Nick's made a great point there. Also bear in mind that the GPU can impact on latency. Yeah, I mean, it certainly can. Do I need a dedicated GPU? And the answer to this is technically no, you don't. Because, you know, with audio, you don't need a dedicated GPU. The whole thing around the GPUs is around your increased visual performance, whether it's, you know, it could be things like gaming, or it could be video editing, or it could be, you know, even things like, you know, some really intense, even things like maybe movies. I mean, the internal integrated GPUs now should handle the movies and things like that fine. But if you want to do something really intensive from a graphics point of view, then yeah, a dedicated graphics card will be the way to go. But audio doesn't work like that. There is some suggestion that a dedicated graphics card, whilst it's not needed for audio, it could be good because it could take some of the work away from the CPU. So even though you don't necessarily need it, you could take some of the work away from the CPU, so the CPU could work more efficiently if you've got a dedicated GPU. And I could understand that. I think the only thing that I think in practicality, does it actually work? And the reason I'm saying this is this. If anyone's got a laptop or desktop with a dedicated GPU, run Studio One or your DAW. Then go into your task manager on Windows. Then have a look at your GPU performance. Does it actually do anything? Is it actually doing anything? The chances are it's not. And the reason it's not actually doing anything is because sometimes you will find that unless you go into the graphics settings and dedicate your GPU to work, your dedicated GPU to work all the time, it won't. Most now have a hybrid mode, so the system will decide whether the GPU gets used or not. And certainly from audio, it won't. There's no need to use a dedicated GPU from that perspective. So I don't think you're going to get any performance boost by having a dedicated GPU. Now, if you've got a laptop, you'll get one anyway, quite frankly, unless you go for some of the lower end stuff. But if you go for anything that's going to have like a Ryzen 7 5800, Ryzen 9, or an i7 11800 or a new 12th gen, you will have some form of dedicated GPU in there. It will probably be a 3060. It'll probably be a minimum depending on what your budget is, but you don't need it. And I would also probably suggest that you probably won't even use it. Another thing to bear in mind is certainly if you've got a desktop unit, and depending on where your motherboard is and what connections you need for your display, my desktop unit wasn't even, you couldn't plug it. You could plug a display into the GPU directly, but it's kind of like the main display port that it was kind of telling you to plug into was the main integrated graphics card. So it wasn't working like a direct connection. And even on laptops, even though you've got have different ports, and depending whether it's Thunderbolt or HDMI or DP or whatever the port will be, not all of them are plugged directly into the graphics card. So you have to do a lot of that with software. So yeah, do you need a dedicated GPU? Technically, no. Could it help? Potentially. But in reality, will it? No, I don't think it will. But if you go for a laptop, it's probably something that you'll have anyway. And if you're like me, that occasionally get the kids that kind of want to shoot the crap out of you on Fortnite, then it's always quite handy to have. So you don't really need a dedicated GPU. But sometimes if it comes with one, they're nice to haves. That's it. Especially with GPU shortages, that should be over now. But yeah, it's not something I would say that you definitely need, but they're just nice to haves if you can get one with your setup. Another thing to bear in mind is with a GPU, you will get more heat in your system, which they have their own dedicated fans. It will have increased noise. So if noise is a consideration, then you got to think about that as well. So I think that's really the main considerations that you kind of got to go. Let me actually give you some tangibles now. Let me actually give you some recommendations. Laptops first and foremost. I would say if you're looking for a laptop for audio production, then once again it all depends on where you are in the world, and depends on the currency conversion rate. If you're in the US, I think it's an absolute no-brainer to get an Apple MacBook Pro for a laptop. I really do. I wouldn't say necessarily the original M1. I wouldn't even say the MacBook Air. But if you can get the M1 Pro, yes, it's $1999, so it's like $2,000. But if you think about that from the equivalent of the UK, that's like 1,500 quid. It'll be interesting to see what some of the other. In fact, I might see if I can quickly do it now. I'm just going to have a quick look on. So on Safari, can I add new tab? Let me have a quick look. What's a good Newegg? US, United States. Let's go for computer systems, laptops. Yeah, laptops, notebooks. Right. Let's go. I'm going to choose gaming only purely because they will have a lot of the features that are more compatible. So this is the thing. If you go for like a 30 series, let's go for, because this is the thing, is when you compare it to something like a Mac, you've got to think about the overall package. Now, RAM's obviously different, but if you're looking at something like that, a 12th gen Intel-based MSI, $3,500. Lenovo Legion 7 with a Ryzen 9 5000 series, £2,300. Sorry, $2,300. The Gigabyte Aorus 17.3 inch with a 1080p display, 12700H. That was over £2,000. 4K display with an 11800H, £2,000. There's another one there, £2,000. I mean, they're looking somewhere between $1,700 and up. I think for the overall package of something like an M1 Pro, I'd still recommend probably an Apple for the American market. I don't know if I would for the UK market. I've bought one purely because I just wanted something that's stable. Would I recommend it? I don't know if I would recommend it for the price. Stability is great. It's super silent. It really is, and I love this thing. Don't get me wrong. But the one I had, and if you was in the UK, once again, I find it very difficult at the moment to be able to recommend an Intel-based laptop because of the core clock speed for mixing and mastering. The one I had that has just gone back. Now, okay, let's be clear about this. It was a Wi-Fi card that died. Pretty much convinced that that's the case. Is that going to happen on every single Asus? No, it's not. And with that particular model, and this is the other thing as well. Let me quickly explain this model. I'll quickly explain more about it in a moment. But you can get that particular model. It's the Asus. Acceptable, right? Okay. That's it. It's the Asus ROG Strix G15, and it's the AMD Advantage, and it comes with a Ryzen 9. It's the 5900HX, but this comes with rather than coming with the NVIDIA graphics card, it comes with an AMD graphics card, and the graphics card is an AMD RX 6800M, which has got 12 gigabytes of VRAM. It's got a QHD screen, 16 gig RAM as standard, 1 terabyte SSD. Battery's not great on it, and I think this is something that you need to think about, especially with laptops as well. But the battery, if you're someone that is going to use it plugged in all the time, I would highly recommend that one. I don't think that Wi-Fi, I think my Wi-Fi card, I'd like to hope, was just a one-off. But the thing with that is it's an all AMD based system, and that's the thing. If you get an AMD Advantage laptop, it's all AMD. So whereas beforehand I mentioned about compatibility and making sure that everything cross matches, so all the brands, making sure everything's compatible and all works with the other components, with this you're not really going to have that issue because you've got an AMD CPU, AMD GPU. The whole lot in there is basically it's AMD inside of an Asus kit. So I'd highly recommend the Asus ROG Strix G15 AMD Advantage. It is a gaming laptop. It looks a bit funky. If you like nice flashing lights, you'll certainly like that. But there's a few things here to quickly point out. With laptops, if you are going to use it unplugged, you will lose performance. A lot of performance on a PC laptop. Apple, you won't. So that's something that if you go for a PC, you would need it plugged in to get the best performance. Noise, they will be noisy, except this particular model. The reason I chose this model was because a lot of the Asus laptops have a silent mode. And I was a bit dubious about this because most laptops now, they have a quiet mode, and the quiet modes on most laptops they're quieter. They're not quiet. They are quieter than the standard. So you'll still hear a fair bit of fan noise. This silent mode was silent. And I was so impressed with that, and I thought there's got to be a massive drop in performance, because that's, once again, if you have a silent mode, or a quiet mode on most laptops, what they would do is they would reduce the capability of your fans to reduce the noise. Less performance on the fans creates more heat. You'll then get thermal throttling, and you will have a massive drop off in performance. With this particular model, they were benchmarks. I looked into a lot of the benchmarks, and even in this silent mode, the performance only dropped very little. I think it was like 10-15%. On an already extremely well-performing machine. So if you want an alternative to a Mac in the UK, that is something I would recommend, is the Asus ROG Strix G15 AMD Advantage. I'd like to think that you wouldn't get one like mine that had a dodgy Wi-Fi card. It comes with a terabyte SSD, fantastic Ryzen 9 processor. The RX 6800M, if anyone is interested, the benchmarks for that particular graphics card fall somewhere in between a 3070 and a 3080 RTX graphics card, which is like, it's great, and it costs a fraction of the price. You'll struggle to get a 3060 machine for 1500 quid, let alone something that performs somewhere between a 3070 and a 3080. So if you want something that's going to be a good all-rounder, great performance, and it runs quietly, yeah, you'll have a drop-off in the quiet mode and performance, but it's not going to be a massive amount like you would with a lot of the others. So that is something I would really recommend, certainly for the UK market. If you didn't want to fork out the money for the Apple, then certainly that's one for that I'd recommend for laptops as an alternative. You won't get Thunderbolt compatibility, so you'd have to use USB-C or USB 2 or USB 3 interfaces. But certainly you've got USB-C. I even think they did. I can't remember. I think it might be HDMI out for the. I think it might be HDMI 2.1 for the ports. But anyway, that is a great alternative, and that comes in at 1500 quid. But that's going to give you a lot. Great screen. Yeah, that was a really good machine, except for the Wi-Fi card. So that's a nice alternative. Like I say, I can't really recommend certainly anything 11th gen or below on the Intel. I'd be interested to see what the 12th gen come out on the laptop side for mixing and mastering, but at the moment I wouldn't recommend them for audio at this present moment. Mac, obviously, for the US market, I think that's just a bit of a no-brainer for the US market. And then the rest of it is really kind of seeing where you are and what the prices are in your region. I think this is the thing, is you've got to look at weigh up the pros and cons. For the UK, I paid for this particular model. What did I pay? I think the base price was $17.69, and this is what baffled me. I bought this for £130 cheaper than if I bought it through Apple Direct. How do they work that one out? There's no distribution, but it cost me £130 cheaper than if I bought it direct through Apple. And it comes with a 2-year guarantee. Apple only offered one. And I got the accidental damage cover for 2 years for an extra 80 quid. It covers exactly the same as the Apple Care, and Apple Care is 260 something pounds. So this is where Apple make their money, and it's just this is why a lot of people don't like Apple, and I can understand it. But for me, have a look around. If you want to get an Apple, have a look around, and it would say it's a 2-year guarantee. It was $17.69. I'll pay for this. It's the M1 Pro, the 14-inch. It's the base model, and it's working fantastically at the moment. So if you do want an Apple, I'd recommend this one. I wouldn't really recommend going too much higher for mixing and mastering. If you wanted something more with more RAM, you could look at those options, but you will pay a premium. Those are my recommendations for laptops. Desktops, pretty much anything goes. And I really do say this. I'll probably fall short of making a recommendation for a desktop, because I don't think there's much point in buying a pre-made desktop, because you are paying a premium just for it being a pre-made desktop, and you're not going to get the most beneficial. If you can get somebody that's going to do a custom build, I got my Who did I use? I used PC Specialist in the UK, but Scan are fantastic, and Scan will really, really help you out. Scan are great in the UK, and there will be loads of companies who can do something similar in the US and around the world. I had bought a system based around the 11700K. It had an Asus. I think it was a Tough Gaming B560 motherboard, and I chose that one because I think that had Thunderbolt capability and capacity, and I wasn't too sure whether I wanted to go Thunderbolt interface at the time. It had 32 gigs of RAM, an RTX 3060, it's water cooled. It had a Corsair Quiet case. What else did it have? It Wi-Fi 6 all built in, and it came with its own antennas, and it was a massive thing. And it wasn't the cheap RAM. I know it was quite good RAM. I think the only thing, once again, I scrimped and I saved a few quid on the hard drive, which was the SSD, and which was a big mistake. But that came in around, I think it was 1,600 quid, and I think that build was with extended warranty and all of that, like 2-day business support and everything as well. So it kind of goes to show, it's like you can get a really good, well-built machine based around, great specs for very little money. It was a custom-built audio machine, but if you wanted to do it yourself, you could save loads of money. Seriously, you could save loads of money by doing it yourself, and it's relatively straightforward to do. One thing I won't recommend at the moment is to buy an Apple desktop. And this is, people may say, well, that's a bit. Why would you not recommend buying an Apple desktop when they've just released the Mac Studio? I still think, ultimately, if you look at the desktop options on the new M1 Apple architecture, I don't think there's many desktop options that I'd really recommend. The M1 Mac Mini was great. I can tell you it was great. But the performance of the M1 chip is looking a bit, I think it would do most of what you'd need it to for audio. It's capped at 16 gigs worth of RAM. Could you run that for a fair while? I think you could. The M1 Mac Mini, but for £1,000, I think I worked it out. It's sort of $699 is the base price. That's with 8 gig RAM and a small hard drive. I think that's right. So if you then doubled the RAM, it put it to $899. To the 512 gigabyte storage, it was $1,099, and to go for 1 terabyte, it was $1,299. So if you think of what you're getting there for $1,299 for a desktop, and if you think about what I paid for the custom built PC, it was literally for an extra 300 quid. You get so much more for your money. So I don't think a Mac Mini is an option. The iMac, 24-inch iMac at the moment, is not an option because it's the same chip in the Mac Mini. You're paying, once again, a premium for a big screen, which if you're getting a desktop, you probably want to have a custom screen anyway. And then you've got to think about the Mac Studio. Mac Studio is interesting. I don't know. So this is where you start to kind of think about the base model is good. You get an M1 Max, which is a great chip, and you get 32 gigs worth of RAM. I can't remember what the storage size is on it. I don't know what the base storage is, but once again, in the UK, you're looking at £2,000. I just don't know, I just don't know if that's a wise buy yet. If you start thinking about the M1 Ultra, but you're paying so much more, so the M1 Ultra is effectively 2 M1 Max chips combined. So you're getting ridiculous performance on it. So if you go for the base M1 Max, so you get a 512 gigabyte SSD storage. You get a lot of ports in it, but once again, you can't update any of the storage or anything. So let me just, if you do, it's the M1 Max, okay, so it's a 10-core CPU, 24-core GPU, and this is the thing, you're paying a load for a GPU, which you don't need that for mixing and mastering. 32 gigs worth of RAM, 2 USB-C ports, loads of Thunderbolt, £2,000. If you like Mac, and you are going to get a really good stable performance, but is it going to? for the equivalent of what you could spend on a PC, like Nick says, if you get something at 12,900K, you know, I'm not sure it's a wise investment yet. I may look at that at some point down the line, but it's certainly not something I would consider at the moment. But if you go for like an M1 Ultra, if you go for even the base M1 Ultra, you've got to stick another 1,400 quid on that, so that puts it up to £4,000. All right, it comes with 64 gig unified memory, a terabyte SSD storage. Double it if you want to double it storage, you've got to pay another 400 quid. So you're looking at £4,000. I think you'll be able to get an amazing PC for £4,000. An amazing PC that would I still think you get an amazing PC for £4,000 that would would it outperform that? I'm sure it would for less money. So I'm still not entirely sure that I'd recommend a desktop Apple at the moment. So that is, I think, if you go in desktop, now I still think that's probably a good option. To look at PCs, Intel, AMD, pretty much your choice. Think of the core concepts though, core clock speed. Make sure you get a good core clock speed. RAM 16GB minimum for mixing and mastering. If you do alternative work like lots of VST instruments and things like that, look at 32 gigs. SSD storage, M.2 storage if you can. You don't need a GPU, but for that price, if you can get one in there, certainly if you do anything like video or that kind of stuff, or all bits and bobs like that, you're going to need some form of GPU in there, and their availability is there at the moment. So I still think for desktop, I'd recommend probably getting a custom built PC. Yeah, so that's basically my fault. It's just been a nightmare. There's so much to it, and I know why so many people kind of get frustrated with it, because I've got so frustrated with it over time, and it's taken. That's why my hair is going grey, just purely because I've been researching computer-based stuff, and it's just been a bit of a nightmare. So that is my little ramble, my little rant about computers. Hopefully you found it useful. Hopefully there's some tips in there that people can look at. Once again, just to reiterate, this is very much looking at it from the perspective of mixing and mastering engineer. Everyone's use cases is going to be slightly different. If you need something with more RAM, once again, if you go Apple route, you'd have to make sure you pay for that up front. With PC, laptop, or desktop, you can pretty much you will get expandability. Just make sure it expands 32 gig. Most laptops now even do 64 gig. But obviously with the PC laptop, there are downsides to it. You'd have to have it plugged in all the time. Performance will drop off dramatically if you unplug it, whereas on the Mac you don't. If you have it on quiet mode on the PC, you would generally have a large drop-off in performance, except if you have a look at some of the Asus stuff. The Asus laptops were a recommendation by Scan. Scan couldn't do a custom-built audio laptop at that time, purely because of the changeover in stock. So where they were going from the 12th gen to 11th gen on the Intel, and from the Ryzen 6, from the Ryzen 5000 series to the Ryzen 6000 series, they were having supply issues, so they couldn't do a custom build laptop at that time. But they recommended Asus because out of the box, generally their setup for audio based work is good. So that's why they recommended Asus. And it wasn't until I started looking into the silent profile and how especially it worked with the AMD model, except for the Wi-Fi card. I'd highly recommend that. If it wasn't for the fact I needed something just a bit more, I didn't want to go for another situation where I had another laptop die on me after already going through three. I think the store started to nickname me the laptop loser. I'd gone through that many laptops in 3 months, so now I'm on number 4 and I'm on the Mac. I'm quite happy with it. So yeah, that's where we are at present. Anyway, that's enough of my waffle. I've been, live for an hour and 40 minutes. Blimey, I've been waffling. Any questions? Not much questions coming through. If anyone's got any questions at all, drop me a question in the chat. Have you found this useful? Is there anything that you've got any questions about? Is there anything you're not sure about in terms of computer specs? Have you got anything you're looking out for? Is there anything particularly you think, I quite like the look of that, and how how it would impact on audio based processing. What's your thoughts? So let me know if you've got any questions. Just while I've got a quick brief minute, just to let you know. So mastering in the box is once again. I'm now got this. It'll be set up back underway. I've just got a few more bits to get downloaded. Make sure I've got all my webcams and everything set up, and I can get crack on and start releasing some more content. Loads lined up. Got lots and lots of stuff lined up. So I'll be getting back into a more regular. A more regular flow with the videos. So that's all. That's not going to stop. But one thing to mention is the mastering services. I'm still offering mastering services. I'm actually also starting to offer mixing services. So I used to do a load of mixing. I kind of really dedicated into the mastering, and I still will dedicate to mastering. That's not going to change. But I will also be offering some mixing services. That is not going to be provided under the brand Mastering in the Box. I really want Mastering in the Box to be the educational side, to be going through tutorials and gear reviews and all that kind of thing. But I've got a new brand called Progressive Sound Audio. And this is purely going to be for the mixing and mastering. So if you start seeing some information regards to Progressive Sound Audio, it's me. It's my second brand that does the mixing and mastering. Steve Benson, I see many of these laptops don't have Ethernet ports. I prefer hardwired networking. A lot of them do. If you have a look at... In fact, most of the ones I've mentioned do. I know that the last one I had, the AMD one, certainly did. Does the Mac does, but I think it's on the power supply. I certainly know that AMD one did. The MSI one, pretty sure it did. And the Lenovo ones, I know they do, but there was a bit of a thing because they were basically on upside down, so it made it a bit of a, you had to kind of lift the back of the laptop to put them in, and then have to lift it up again to take them out, which was a bit of a strange thing. MSI Creator Z16, I know that did. That was made for creators. That was a good system. That really was a good system, but it was just that whole issue with the mismatch between the drivers, just a pain in the backside. And that is unfortunately some of the downside with PC. I think when you spend the time with the PCs and you really get into the nitty gritty and you go through the optimization, that can be great. But it just takes a bit of time. Interestingly, the MSI doesn't mention it, so maybe it didn't. I'm pretty sure it did, but I could be wrong. I've gone through so many of them now, it probably they all roll into one. I certainly know that last one did, the AMD one. He said AMD Strix G15 Advantage. It was, to be fair, I know it was a gaming laptop, but it looked really nice. Even the RGB lights, I just thought they looked... You look at the pictures and it doesn't do it justice. The pictures make it look as if it's just cheap and tacky. It's not. It's a really well-made machine. I've got a funny feeling the Ethernet on there... Yeah, the Ethernet's on the back of the Asus. So that's definitely got it on there, and it's up the right way. So that's on there. And I'm pretty sure, without rummaging around, yeah, gigabit Ethernet port. So that was on there. I'm pretty sure Apple MacBook Pro 14. I'm pretty sure it's attached to the battery pack. Free Thunderbolt 4 ports, HDMI port, SDX card, MagSafe 3 port, Magic Keyboard, 67 watt adapter. They don't make these things easy for you to find, do they? I could just go behind the desk and actually have a look, but MagSafe 3, Magic Keyboard, Touch ID, Force Trackpad, 67 watt. Mind you, it doesn't say it, does it? I may have missed backside ports and Asus. Yeah, this is the thing. The Asus are the Asus ports. They're actually, to be fair, they're really well designed, because a lot of them are on the back, so you don't see them. And the way that the screen folds up is if I remember correctly, yeah, it's not like at the back of the back. It's not a back hinge. It's kind of like a top hinge. It looks really classy, but of course you've got a lot of ports on the back, which just make it much easier. Certainly, if you want a kind of a semi-stable setup as well, you can have all your Ethernet port in the back. I think they had the HDMI in the back, and I think there was a USB-C. I can't remember. There might be a USB 3.0 in the back as well. So there's quite a few on the back as well as the sides, which was great. Yeah, MacBook Pro. I'll have to look into that. I was pretty sure. MacBook Pro 14. Ethernet. Don't tell me this is something else they want to charge it for. So I was currently watching an Asus ZenPad tablet. Yeah, Asus do some great stuff. It's my first Asus I had, and it was just such a shame with that Wi-Fi card, because otherwise I still would have had it now, and I'd loved it, and it was great. It did everything that I wanted it to do, but the Wi-Fi card died, and I just thought to myself, you know what? I'm spending X amount of money on this particular laptop, and it's like, I just want to make sure that I'm comfortable with it, and I've got the peace of mind that, you know, after a couple of months or a few weeks, or a few weeks in my case, it seems to be, something else goes wrong with these blooming laptops. Ethernet. Some of my Mac models Ethernet port. If your Mac power adapter doesn't have an Ethernet port, you can use an Ethernet adapter. I don't know. I'll have to confirm that, because I'm pretty sure the adapter. I'm pretty sure it's got something on the adapter, the power cable. I'll have to have a look and see if there's something on there. But yeah, Asus were highly recommended. The other ones that what were the other ones that were highly recommended? The ROG Zephyrus series. They're meant to be great. I think for them, it was becoming a bit more spaceshipy with the white and LEDs on the back of the lid and things like that. I mean, the ROG Strix was with the Go Faster red stripes and the nice flashy, nice flashy lights, and it was enough for me. Let alone we're having something that's pristine white and flashing as well. That was a bit too much for me. But they're meant to be good as well. The Asus ROG Zephyrus G14. There's so many different varieties depending on what kind of model, whether you go for the Asus, the AMD models, or we go for the Intel models. You know, once again, the MSI Creator Z16, it's not to say it's a bad laptop. It was a good laptop, except for the mismatches with the graphics drivers. The i7, I didn't really have too much of trouble with it, but then I really never had a chance to push it to its limits. And I think that's the thing. I felt much more comfortable with the AMD version, knowing that the core clock speed would have been much more capable of running the more dense audio projects than the Intel. It's not to say the Intel is a bad CPU. I just don't think it's as good for audio as the AMD based on that alone. So Right. Any other questions at all? So the fact I've been going almost 2 hours suggests to me I've got more waffle than the Belgian bakers. Reminds me of a joke, actually. The other day I made a Belgian waffle. The following day I made a Frenchman talk a load of, doodahs. I'll leave out the expletive there. Right. Well, if there's no more questions, I'm going to call it a day there, I think, because it's coming up 10 o'clock, and as you can see from my ugly mug, I need a lot of beauty sleep. So what I'll do is I'll just say thank you for everyone once again. Thank you for staying patient. Thank you to everyone who's joined in with the this live stream. I see that there's quite a lot of views here. It is a frustrating subject. It's not something that's really covered too much in depth. Everyone looks at benchmarks. Everyone looks at multi-core, single-core scores. But it doesn't mean that that's going to be great for audio work. So hopefully this is giving you some kind of insight as to what kind of things to look for. And if anyone's got any questions at all, or if anyone has got anything they're looking at that they want me to have a look at, then certainly drop me a message, drop me a note, add a comment in the comment section down below, and I'll certainly have a look and get back to you. I'm not going to claim to be a full, a massive IT professional, but unfortunately, I've had to learn a lot because it is turned into a right pain in the old Aristotle, let's say. So so hopefully this has kind of helped you out with some knowledge. Hopefully it'll potentially make some more informed purchasing decisions moving forward. So without further ado, thank you once again. Thanks for your patience whilst there's been a bit of a delay getting all this new content out. There's loads more coming out. And if anyone wants to find out any more on the Progressive Sound Audio, it is www.progressivesoundaudio.com, or you can go to the www.masteringinthebox.net website, and there's a link in there as well. So where it says the mixing and mastering tab, it should take you directly through to Progressive Sound Audio. So yeah, thanks again for all your support, guys, and I'll speak to you lot very soon. See you later.